So tell me about your kids.
Ah, what a great question. You know, I've got two daughters, and it's funny, Halloran, one of them's a writer, so she's teaching and writing in New York. She writes for the Huffington Post. She's shopping her first novel around. She's teaching at Columbia, so she's made it to the Ivy League. And my other daughter is an attorney in Nashville. She's been a prosecutor for most of her practice, 5 years, so trying major felony cases and all that stuff. And now she's gone into private practice and is getting a different look at the practice of law. But you know how this is because of your three children. They're the joy of my life.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Tell me about God.
God is, I talked earlier about the humility of how we approach our lives and our learning, and how important it is for us to come to grips with the fact that others are going to help us reach our potential and our possibility. I think that may be the single most important truth I can express when you ask me about God. The first thing I have to say about God, Halloran, is we don't understand God. We understand things about God. We believe we do, and we approach God. That's why we call it faith. But God is, all I have to do is sit back and reflect on the fact that we're on this little obscure rock and in a corner of a very kind of mediocre, nondescript star that we're circling around at about 40,000 miles an hour, and a galaxy with billions of stars in a universe with billions of galaxies. And then you ask me about God. And the God I worship is behind all of that. So I think the first thing that I'm always reminded of when somebody wants to start talking about theology is we have to be very humble about it. We can't be certain, and we don't want to be spiritually arrogant or self-righteous. If I understand anything about Jesus' ministry, it's that the greatest barrier to our spiritual growth is probably self-righteousness. That's why I think he just butted heads so often with the Pharisees, is they thought they had it all figured out. They had God in a box. Here were the things that God required, and if you just did those things, you would have the right spiritual life. And I think Jesus taught us that that wasn't quite true.
Halloran, there's one book you must read, other than the Bible, before you die. It's in my library, and it is...
Ha! That's good. Of course, I'd tell them they need to read 10 things that your minister wants to tell you.
Right.
They can't
Your
because they're
book.
my book.
Right.
But I'm not going to do that to them. It's funny, Halloran. I go through so many books, fiction and nonfiction. The best book recently I've read is probably Lila, which won the National Book Award for Fiction, Marianne Robinson's book, which is loaded up with great theology. It's about an old preacher whose life intersects with a young homeless woman that he ends up marrying, and how innocently she asks questions of our institutional religion that we've grown up, and how wise it makes the old preacher become. You think the old preacher's the old wise guy, but it's the young innocence of this woman who had grown up outside the church, whose questions really lead to wisdom. So the most recent book that I would say that I think people ought to read is that book, Lila. I think it's a spectacular read, and if you read that, you'll want to read Gilead too. But it's how we learn books. So I think we ought to be reading all we can for as long as we're on the planet.
In 15 seconds, define success.
I would say success is reaching your possibility as a human being, which is the theme of your life, of trying to enable people to do that. And success really is about reaching your possibility and your potential.
Biggest mountain you had to climb?
You know, there's some you can't talk about
Yeah.
because you don't want to hurt anybody else. And people have hurt me in my life. So betrayals, but that's not the stuff you want to talk about because you don't want to point the finger at anybody else. So it was tough losing my mother in a car wreck. It was sudden. That was hard. But it's funny, so can little things, Howler. And I think about our young people. Nothing was harder for me than having to quit playing football when I was a kid. I got 3 concussions my first year in college, and Bill Yeomans was such a kind team doctor, and he came in and the first thing he said was, "Buzz, you know you're never going to play in the NFL, right?" And I was like, "Yeah, Doc, I figured out that. I'll do well to play here,"
Right.
you know. But having to let go of things, which gets us back to spirituality. And, you know, we can learn a lot from our Buddhist friends. I think about what the Dalai Lama tries to teach us about not being so attached to the things of this world and how even our human attachments.
Well, Jesus even said that.
Knowing that we don't own our children, that they're on loan to us, that our spouses are just on loan to us, that they're not ours, and that we're just a passing through, as we used to sing in church.
Wow. You got a beautiful life story. I'll ask you one final question on this Web Extra. What song, and everybody does this, everybody dances in the kitchen, right? Everybody is in the kitchen, some music's playing, it's Goofy weekend, and you're dancing in the kitchen.
I love
What
this stuff.
song turns you out? I mean, you can't resist it, and you just let it go.
It's the old R&B great stuff, you know. It's Wilson Pickett and Sam and Dave and Aretha Franklin, all that stuff I grew up listening to and playing in an R&B band. When I was a kid, I was a bass player in a band that had a black singer that sounded like Otis Redding, man. And he had trouble with pitch, and I was pretty good at pitch. I couldn't sing like him, but I'd just get right up next to his ear, and if I'd hit the note, he could nail it. He was awesome. I wish I could sing like that. If I come back in another life someday, I'm going to be a Pip or a Four Top or something where I get to move and sing. So probably, I was listening to David Ruffin this morning coming into work singing "Ain't Too Proud to Beg." That's about as good as it gets, Halloran.
Thank you for being here.
Thanks, man. I appreciate you.
Blessings on you. Thank you.